Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Rachel Thieler, NACD's Southwest Region Representative. Ariel started a trend with her background photo. So this is one of my favorite photos of my husband when he was smoke jumping. He's under the parachute there. Thankfully for my sanity, he doesn't smoke jump anymore. He stays on the ground most of the time. So anyway, I'll be facilitating this panel. We'll be talking about conservation districts in action, advancing their role in assisting communities prepare for and recover from disaster-related events. And thanks everybody for joining us. As with the other panels, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please put any questions you may have into the chat so that we can discuss those at the end. So first up, we have Chris Lutz and Lowell Ballard with the Timmins Group, and they're filling in for Deborah Smith. They'll be discussing Arizona's efforts to showcase conservation district work through a GIS portal system. So take it away.
Thanks. And Chris is going to drive the slides, and then we're going to do some demo stuff. So I'm gonna do the intro parts, and then we're going to flip over and look at some real things in action. And I don't mind if people interrupt as we move through it. I know we only have about 15 minutes, but it doesn't bother me if you have questions as we move through to interrupt a little bit. So anyways, this project is with Deb. Unfortunately, she was not able to be on the call today, but she has a really great partnership going with NRCS in Arizona, and she has some what I would consider pretty awesome goals for where she wants to take the program. And I really think it could be a good model for where things go in the future. A lot of what this project is about is, she's really trying to help the state, all the conservation districts, and other people that are interested party in the state, really think very strategically and proactively about, where they want to prioritize work on the ground, how they plan to implement grant work out on the ground, how they more effectively collaborate across jurisdictional boundaries, across agency boundaries, state, locals, et cetera, and ultimately get set up to say, we understand, where the biggest issues are on the ground, where we should be prioritizing conservation delivery, and, how do we put dashboards and metrics and other things that are very visual out there to help show that we're having some sort of impact out on the ground. So it falls in line with a lot of other initiatives, USDA shared stewardship initiatives, and a lot of other things that, are working towards the same thing, all hands, all lands, all those sorts of ideas. All right, go ahead. So we work on a lot of projects like this, and generally the way we try to think about the world is, in order to help Deb and all the conservation districts prioritize where they do the work, there's a lot of things on the ground that can help us make those decisions. So there's generic, what I would call sort of inventory work. For example, where do we have soils on the ground? Where do we have areas? Go back a little bit. Sorry, I think you got click happy there. Then what we want to do is we want to basically sort of assess the landscape. So we want to say, look, these areas have specific resource concerns. They could be fire, they could be water, they could be riparian. So we kind of want to use the raw information to help us, and then do analysis to help light up those areas where we should be doing service delivery. The next thing we want to do is, people give us money, and they want proof and clarity that we're delivering service in the right areas. So ultimately we get money to plant, thin, burn, do veg management out on the ground. And then finally, the next thing, click, would be to ultimately prove we had some sort of formidable outcome. We had some tangible, whether it's reduced risk, whether it's better water quality, air quality, whether it's, more productive landscapes, whether it's, managed veg departure, whatever it is. So it's, it's really assess, prioritize, do the work, and show outcomes. And that's kind of the world in which we live. So go ahead. The way that we think about storytelling is, I've been a big fan that, a picture's worth 1,000 words and a map's worth 1,000 pictures. I'm very big on, turning data into information and thinking about, data-centric decision-making and storytelling. So here you can see there's various conservation districts in Arizona and the state. Lutz will demo this stuff in a little bit, but really what we're doing is sort of putting what we know about the landscape from assessments and other information, and we kind of put it in a data blender to help us, tell better stories about what we did and how we did it. All right. This is just a little bit of insight into DEB's district-wide conservation action plan, and I won't obviously read this whole thing, but basically they want to figure out where the local priorities are and high-risk resource concerns are. We want to look at sort of that base information like land ownership, geology, population, roads. So all those things are relatively informative, but when we get into chapter 2 is where we really get the big bang for the buck. So that's things like, where do we have wildfire risk and where do we have veg departure? Where do we have, forest to faucets, high priority water sheds that deliver drinking water for, whatever purpose, for human beings, whatever. Then we want to kind of understand, what actions have already been planned. So where are those recommended practices, what's been done on the ground, and then ultimately come up with, the little prescriptive needle there next to chapter 4 is, okay, we've looked out on the ground, we know where the problems are and what are we going to do and what are our recommended practices. And then chapter 5 is really, showing that we've done something and we've, been very strategic and we're not doing random acts of conservation and mitigation out on the landscape. All right. And again, I won't go through this too much because Lutz is going to actually demo this, but this just gives you a little bit of a feel for how the portal will work. And so we'll demo this in a second, but basically, we're looking at data, we're doing assessments, we're defining these areas of interest out on the ground, we're tagging them with specific NRCS driven resource concerns. Ultimately we'll then say, and here's the practices that we recommend based on your resource concerns out on the ground. So it's a very thoughtful sort of orchestrated process. I'm mildly OCD about, and you can click on this one again, hit one more time. Yep. I'm mildly OCD about this shared stewardship concept. I mean, I look at it like, there's a lot of people with a lot of funding that are out there trying to do work out on the ground. The more that we can break down these silos of, NGOs and BIA and BLM and FWS and locals and state and all of those things, and just think about the fact that we might not have the same priorities, but we probably have some overlapping priorities, and really how do we align our projects to get the most bang for the buck is something I'm relatively obsessed with solving. You can hit click. I think there's a couple more at the bottom, like NGOs and NPS, BIA, locals, et cetera. So yeah, break down these silos is very important to me. So go ahead. The other sort of thing I would say, and Ann, to your point about wanting some actions as to what we would come out of this, I think collaboration would be a giant action for me, and breaking down these silos of work plans. The other one is that I think we really have to embrace data, and that's got to become sort of a way that we communicate and track and collaborate, and so data's the new bacon. Makes everything better. And with that, I'm going to have Lutz pop over and actually do some real stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Lowell. So this is our AACD Conserve AZ portal. So we have a landing page for them to come in, giving everyone a little bit of background information about what the portal is and why they've developed it. Once we've entered the portal, we have a map-centric view for them. We have them looking at conservation districts, and you can see these little blue outlines are the actual areas of interest that the folks within Arizona have. On the left side over here, you can see we have a few different buttons here in this panel. The first one is the inventory, and we wanted to give everyone the ability to see a bunch of different layers of data. So within each of these accordions, we have a list of the layers that can be turned on and off throughout the application. So to kind of show you just how to turn them on, you can see that they will appear in the map, and within them, you can zoom in and out and kind of figure out your own location within the map. Some other pieces of functionality that we have within these layers is we've identified layers that have identifiable features. So for example, I turn on the counties. What I can do is zoom into a location, hit this identify area button. And what it will do is pull out some general information about what you're seeing in your viewpoint port on the map. So you can see we've got conservation districts. Underneath, we'll have some other information about the counties. So here we have our county information. And what we've done is, it's not all of the layers within the application, but it is a decent number of them. So all of the ones that have these little icons over here can have some sort of identifiable information. The other icon here is around actually creating the area of interest. So we have a few ways that you can do that. The first way is by just drawing simple polygons on a map. And with this, you know, it might not always be in one area. So we wanted to give the users the ability to draw multiple areas within one, we're calling a area of interest. So once you've drawn all of your areas of interest, what we do is take a little snapshot of that and allow you to enter in a name of some sort. So just give it a simple name here. And what this does is now gives you your area of interest. And so once you've drawn those on the map, you want to be able to manage them and kind of add some additional information to those. So we have this management tab up here at the top right. And within here is where you can see the areas of interest that you've created, and also any areas of interest that might have been created by other users within this portal. So going back to mine, here we have a manage my area. And within that, it takes you to a specific view of that area. And right now we allow the users to add some resource concerns in those areas. So we've taken all of the NRCS resource concerns and added them into this list. And so each area can be given one or multiples of any of these resource concerns. And in the future, we're looking to expand this to allow for actions and other pieces of mitigation that might come along with your area of interest. So that's how you manage the area. Along with that, we also have reports that are driven by the areas. And so far I might not have one ready. I apologize for that. Within these, they have identified these different sectors of information that they want us to run some reports on and spit out some maps and some tables of the information. So I'll pop this open.
While he's pulling that up, basically what it does is it takes the polygon that you defined and you tagged it with the resource concerns, and it sort of automatically rips through a bunch of both assessed data layers and inventory data. It basically generates these reports on the fly based on those thematic categories that he just showed.
Exactly. So you can see here that we've identified the maps that needed to be generated. So we take those layers and pop them into this view so that any user can come in here and copy and paste an image if they need to add it to a different report. So we try to make it super easy for each of the users. And along with some of these maps, we also have tables, and the tables will show the different amounts of acres or percentages of those certain categories of the layers themselves. So it hopefully gives everyone a quick view of each of the types of resource concerns and just items that are going on in your area of interest. Along with some of this other stuff, as Lowell mentioned before, we have some dashboards. We've only been able to insert one so far for vegetation change. It was a lot of work on the data side to get this straight for them. But what we've done now is insert it into this view where you can get a snapshot of the vegetation departure within the conservation districts and also within the watershed boundaries. So clicking on Big Sandy, which is one of the conservation districts in Arizona, you can see we have some general information about it and the total acreage, the amount of change. And then we've also broken down the percentage of those departures within the categories that we identified for the vegetation change. So hopefully in the future, we'll be adding in more of these types of dashboards so that the people in Arizona will have their different categories and dashboards for the different types of resource concerns and objects like that. So with that.
All right. Yep. I appreciate that, Chris. And Ann asked a little bit about like what options are there for other states. And, this did take a fair amount of work with Deb, and some of her staff to come up with, what those assessment data layers should be. I think we've made a lot of progress that would be applicable, pretty much in the whole country, but especially in the West, because, there's a lot of things that are out there. There's, some of these data sets are relatively readily available, like wildfire risk and priority watersheds and stuff. And, we can definitely help folks identify where those things are and where they come from and the pedigree for those. But, I'm in a lot of meetings around shared stewardship and wildfire, and in a lot of meetings, people will go, oh, and by the way, the conservation districts help us deliver this, but the conservation districts are never in those meetings. And it's always a little bit annoying to me. So I would love to figure out how to, bridge the gap again and break down these silos a little bit of folks that I know are really important in the conversation, which are conservation districts, and get them at the table around these water and fire problems that will not get any easier moving forward.
Well, thank you, Lowell and Chris, for sharing Arizona's innovative conservation portal efforts. We appreciate it. So next up, we have Lisa Kilders. Lisa is the Education and Outreach Program Manager for the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District. The floor is yours, Lisa.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Lisa Kilders, and I've been with the Soil and Water Conservation District in Clackamas County for 12 years. Our involvement with wildfire preparedness, we haven't done anything as exciting as a lot of the people we've heard from today, but we have an annual Conservation District employee training and networking conference every year. And one year we had invited Craig Nelson, who we'll be hearing from shortly. He's the Executive Director at the Okanagan Conservation District in Washington State. And he shared his experience with the terrible wildfires that burned a lot of his conservation district. And this started we began thinking about, geez, what can we do? So we were inspired and came back to our district and started talking to our local, we had a meeting and invited our local county disaster management director. We had the local foresters from the State Department of Forestry, our cooperative extension forester, obviously, who we knew. We also have a wildland fire department or fire training program at our local community college, and our county farm forestry association. We had a landowner from that group, and then also our local conservation district conservationist from NRCS. And we didn't all know each other, and so we sat down and started talking, find out what everyone did and how all the pieces fit together when there is a natural resource issue or a disaster issue. And a lot of them didn't know the Soil and Water Conservation District. A lot of us are the best kept secrets in town, even though we've been around for a long time. And we started talking about the things we could do, but figured out our lowest hanging fruit and one of the most immediate needs was to offer wildfire preparedness workshops to some of the areas in our county that were high risk. Our county runs the gamut of being a partially Portland metropolitan area, all the way up to very remote areas on Mount Hood. So our biggest challenge at that point was trying to reach our target audience to invite them to such a such an educational event. And in a lot of those areas, especially the areas that were high risk that butted up against the national and the state forest, they don't have very good internet connections. So we couldn't use our traditional Facebook and a lot of the electronic communications that we normally do. And so we went back to the old-fashioned sending a postcard in the mail. And we found that in a lot of these areas, this is what works best for us to try to reach these folks. I know it's old-fashioned, but we have our GIS layers that we can create mailing lists, and we send these things out. We offered 3 workshops and had very good attendance. Actually, one of them on Mount Hood was so enthusiastic. The local fire department joined in with us and hosted. And we had so many people coming and calling in to reserve a seat. We only had a limited space. We had to have an extra workshop up there to get all the people in. And that was very encouraging. We were excited to keep going and see how else we could all plug in and fit together. But then COVID hit and all the restrictions from that. And then also a lot of the capacity of the district and a lot of the agencies were reduced because we had to work from home. We had childcare issues. So we didn't do anything on this front last year. But unfortunately, last fall, our county was hit with a terrible wildfire. And even our brand new conservation district office was evacuated. We were in the evacuation zone, which seemed very odd to us because we are so close to the urban areas. But it was a new ball game for all of us on many levels. Staff and many of our board members were evacuated from their homes, and some for up to a week. So when we all got back together and things settled down, we started to get phone calls from folks who needed help. They didn't know what to do once they had dealt with homes or outbuildings that had burned. They had land that was scorched and they didn't know what to do with it. And we figured out that this came at a very awkward time of the year for us. It was at the cusp of being too cold to seed. And by the time many people started calling us, it was too late to seed or very close to it. And we were having disagreements within our own office on what to recommend. What kind of seed, when to seed, should we seed now, should we seed in the spring? And seeing this in our own office, I knew that that had to be the case with the other districts. So we contacted our Oregon Department of Agriculture, the Soil and Water Conservation District Program operations specialist, and he helped set up an emergency meeting. And I knew the NRCS state plant materials specialist, so I contacted Kathy and the state forester, the new state forester from NRCS, and begged. I knew they were very, very busy, but they were gracious enough to give us an hour of their time. And we had a very, very well-attended phone call from all the districts that in the area that had wildfire connections. And we listened to them. They gave us what we will be seeing out in the ground, what we should recommend. There was a lot of questions and answers and discussions, and it gave our planners just confidence that they could go out, and everyone was giving the same information, and we felt confident about what we were telling people. But this is really not our normal mode of operation. We don't deal with a lot of burned areas. So I think that's a big need, is to get the training for the conservation planners on how to deal with it, plus the safety issues. There's a lot of things you don't think about when you're out in burned areas. There's things you could step on that you could go through, and you have hot spots and trees that can come down. So that's one of the big needs we found out of this whole thing. We also found out that we needed a lot more access to engineering, because with the real steep slopes that were burned, that's way beyond our bailiwick. We don't, that's more engineering assistance that we needed to try to help our landowners find, and that was difficult too. But fortunately, we were able to get there was some funding assistance from the Natural Resources Conservation Service and Farm Services Agency. And then there was also our local, actually with our state Watershed Enhancement Board offered funding. Everybody wanted to help, and it was difficult. None of us had really experienced this before, and a lot of people wanted to know what to do, but we didn't know how to plug in. So we're finding that even though we're newbies at this, we certainly want to continue building those relationships, because that's going to help us know better next time. Hopefully there won't be a next time, but probably there will be, when we can plug in, where we should plug in, and to have the confidence to do that. So if that's something that we can work on with getting more people involved, providing whatever we can, knowing what to plug in, when to plug in, and getting the training to do so, I think that would be very helpful for all the districts in our area. And I don't have anything fun to show. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for sharing your lessons learned after the smoke cleared. I appreciate it. So now it's time to hear from California. Joining us, we have Lori Tippin, who is a member of the Honey Lake Valley Resource Conservation District, and Steve Hayes, the district manager for Sierra Resource Conservation District. And I'll hand it over to you, Lori and Steve.
All right, thank you, Rachel. As Rachel said, I'm Lori Tippin, and I'm from the Honey Lake Valley Resource Conservation District, where I'm a director on the board of directors. I also wear a number of other hats in the Resource Conservation District field. I'm a member of the board of directors for the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, and I'm chair of the Joint Forestry Committee. California Association Resource Conservation District had a forestry committee, and recently, about a year ago, joined with the state's Forest Stewardship Coordinating Committee to form one integrated committee. So I'm the chair of that. So California's 96 RCDs are diverse in their capacities and their programs. And I'm sure that's similar to many of the RCDs in your states as well. Some of our RCDs receive state baseline funding through property tax assessments, and others receive no funding other than through grants, agreements, and contracts to fund their work in their organizations. My RCD is one of the lower capacity RCDs within the state of California. We have one staff member, and we really have to drill down and focus on what are our priorities because of our limited capacity. Many other RCDs have established forestry programs. Working with landowners to reduce fire hazards is really common throughout the Sierra Nevada and the Southern Sierras and Southern California. So today, Steve and I, well, primarily Steve, will share the experience of his RCD in emergency response to a 2020 wildfire and their subsequent fire recovery response. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you now and hope that we've got your audio working well.
All right. Well, thank you, Lori. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Thumbs up. Sorry, it took about 3 devices. So I'm right now, I'm over at the former Albury mill site, about 25 miles northeast of Fresno. And so communications is sometimes infrequent and a real challenge. The Sierra RCD encompasses about 2 million acres. It's one of the larger RCDs in California. It goes from the crest of the Sierras through the headwaters and forest lands and rangelands down into the Great Valley and into irrigated lands. And I've been involved with CRCD for about 20 years and became a program manager originally with CRCD about 14 years ago, dealing with what was called the Cal-Fed Bay Delta program and the Watershed program for the upper San Joaquin River. I'd be part of the Sierra National Forest. I'm certified in integrated resource management, and I've worked for many years in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, mostly in wilderness areas between Yosemite and Kings Canyon, Sequoia National Park. So I really love this area, been in the area for about 50 years. And essentially the RCD to me is probably the most hidden jewel that other agencies should be looking at. It is a great opportunity to get closer to the community that we serve. And I understand that that was also expressed by Esther earlier with the NRCS. As it relates to our capacity as a governmental entity, I believe we did everything right. If we're talking about pre-disaster planning, we're an integral part of the Fresno County multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. We have all our projects listed. We have all the projects for the 2 fire safe councils in which we work with under MOUs. And everything was certified and approved through county OES, state OES, and FEMA as well. So the question is what you have on paper versus what may occur in the future. So most of our focus was on prevention. We have been greatly funded through the California Fire Safe Council. These are actually federal funds that are being channeled in to work on what's called SRA, state responsibility areas. We had a great prevention and stewardship program within the WUI, the wildland, the urban intermix. As we would say, not interface is not a clear delineation. So you have public and federal lands all in the mix. On September 4th, spark occurred. Next thing you know, the largest single fire event in the history of California since the gold rush occurred, and it hit close to home. So all of a sudden, myself and others were forced evacuated. It did not matter that I was a local governmental entity. It did not matter whether or not the governor had proclaimed that all state agencies are to provide maximum resources towards the suppression and recovery of the Creek Fire, a fire that hit 400,000 acres, destroyed 855 homes and other structures, suppression cost of $180 million plus, and the loss of about 400 million, maybe more, if you include replacement costs of people's properties. They lost their whole, the whole social fabric was torn apart with mass evacuations. So I've been back last couple of weeks, and we're preparing now to go back into the forest. The question was, what was it like? What was the communications? What was the chain of command? What role did our RCD play? When the advance team came in to set up the incident command center for aerial and ground support, we were told at that time we could stay and provide a support role. And that, in fact, if we saw anything that could be improved, that let us know. However, this became a situation at what we call guns and hoses, which I didn't understand when that phrase was used. I was thinking about my earlier years in some musical group, and it came where another authority would override the one that gave permission for our RCD to provide support, work with the local community, look at the evacuation, is it being performed in an orderly fashion. It went all the way up to the highest levels, And essentially, if we could not provide law enforcement, if we could not provide suppression capability, then we were just a civilian, even though the governor did declare an emergency and that he wanted all state resources to be brought to bear. So we had to reestablish our operations within days while the fire was still raging and moving out into the wilderness area where most of the, let's say, the acreage was impacted if you look at the size of the fire. But on a socioeconomic basis in our community, it was a terrible catastrophe. And our staff said, okay, they don't know us. They don't know what our CD is. We're going to put together our own plan. So we established a recovery and prevention program. And within days, going off the whiteboard, we started to implement it. We got out there and met with, when you say meet, is via Zoom or Teams with the WORT team. What the heck is a WORT? Well, it turns out it's a Watershed Emergency Response Team on a statewide basis with all the agencies engaged, Cal OES leading it, FEMA participating, and the counties involved. We participated in the county's Watershed work group for recovery. We got out there, and our best partner out of all this, who probably didn't have the most responsibilities, turned out to be the NRCS. And so eventually we were being trained on post-fire recovery conditions that was provided by California State Water Resources Control Board. And we were starting to go out there and make a difference. We had 7, since it was winter, we had 7 storm readiness volunteer days, about $75,000 in materials and volunteer hours. Even those who had lost their homes were involved. If they didn't lose their homes, they were out there helping. It's been amazing. The question is, okay, what do we take away from this? And it seems to me that we didn't really do a kind of a simulation, taking what our hazard mitigation plan was and some of the working elements, and see how to go through a simulation. And that the other part was communications, that the availability, the quality, and the frequency and consistency of communications, it was like a fog of war. But in this case, until the smoke dissipated, it was about 9 weeks in that respect. So I guess my story to share is that our CDs are essential. It was mentioned that we fill in that space from state and federal, as well as local authorities, that we're representative of the communities. Our boards are volunteer. A lot of us work on a part-time basis. That's our homes, our backyards, where we recreate and how we make our living, and it's a sense of place. So to me, there needs to be some additional focus as it relates to the communities that we all serve. I looking back, I have to say it was quite impressive, the amount of resources that were brought in. It was really essential, and the results were that there was not one loss of life, but it did hit close. Our financial manager lost her home, and doesn't even know if she'll be able to rebuild. So the president of the Highway 168 Fire Safe Council, he lost his home. Many members of our local volunteer fire departments lost their home. So I guess when it's all said and done, and there's still a lot of emotions associated with this, I just thank God that we made it through. But please, please, let's look at what RCDs can do. They're the most let's say, most overlooked and under-resourced governmental entities that we have that I think can really serve the people's needs. And let's get ready for the next disaster, the next emergency, and let's all work together. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to pick it back up again to kind of close us out in the few minutes that are left. And many folks today, starting with Chris French's opening statements this morning, is that it's really imperative to ask who's not at the table. Because as Steve said, RCDs can be easily overlooked in emergency response to an incident, including when the incident authorities or jurisdiction changes hands. So RCDs have a responsibility to reach out and engage with established networks so that they can foster those working relationships in advance of the next catastrophic incident. I know from my own RCD's personal experience this last summer with a wildfire that we had here that burned about 11,000 acres of private land. The Fire Safe Council asked if the Honey Lake Valley RCD would be willing to take the lead and be the lead agency on a grant to FEMA. And we were informed later on that because our RCD had not participated in the hazard mitigation plan at the local level, that we couldn't apply for any FEMA funds and take the lead with the rest of the partners. So somebody else has had to step in to do that. So RCDs need to actively participate in the development of these multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plans so that they can contribute during emergency response and post-fire recovery effort, as Steve's RCD is doing. And then, secondly, another action that I think is important is that on wildland fires, transition plans or delegation of authorities during wildfire response, they need to recognize the important role that RCDs play in the community so that RCDs can appropriately engage in emergency response. And the word of RCDs needs to pass from as the fire gets bigger and a different team comes in, incident management team comes in, RCDs need to be included in that change of authority so that those in charge do know that RCDs are available to help. So thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Lori and Steve, for sharing your firsthand experiences as to why it's so important that conservation districts be involved with post-fire recovery. So now we'll move on and we'll hear from Craig Nelson of Washington. Craig is the Executive Director for the Okanagan Conservation District. Go ahead, Craig.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Craig Nelson. I'm the Executive Director for the Okanagan Conservation District and going to talk about state and private land bear teams. This is something that we put together after our then largest wildfire in Washington State in 2014. And Steve is absolutely right. You got to be prepared for the next one because, as you'll see here, we've had some large fires over the last few years. So just to kind of give you a quick overview, this is the preponderance of our county. We're the largest county in Washington State. We're right up against the Canadian border on the east slopes of the Cascades. In 2014, this orange outline has kind of got a little donut hole here in the middle. It didn't burn, but everything around it did. That was the Carlton Complex fire, burned just over 250,000 acres. The majority of it burned in less than about 4 or 5 days. Then in 2015, the very next year, about 13 months after the Carlton Complex started, then we got 3 lightning strike fires that are right here, kind of in the mid to the eastern side of our county. And those 3, along with this small one over here and another small one up north, burnt another 500,000 acres. So in less than 17 months, we burned just over 750,000 acres in our county alone. along with some that were burnt up from south of us and crept into our county as well. We lost hundreds of homes in those 2 years. In 2015, we unfortunately lost 3 firefighters, fatalities, and 1 severely injured. And then we skipped forward a couple of years, and just this last summer, we had another large, relatively large, about 18,000 acre fire here. And then this one was a nearly 200,000 acre fire, and it actually burned further south into other counties and burned another couple 100,000 acres, but they split it because it crossed the Columbia River. So they considered it 2 different fires, even though really it was one. But yeah, we had another fatality in that fire. Unfortunately, it was a small child. You know, lots of other damage, agriculture infrastructure damage, millions of dollars in public infrastructure damage, and of course loss of a lot of threatened and endangered species habitat. So we had a lot of work to do, starting in 2014, and one of the first things that we looked at was burned area emergency response. It's a federal program. It was created actually by the Forest Service in Southern California back in, I think it was the 1930s. It's been around for a long time. And it has, of course, evolved and improved scientifically many times over. But really, you know, it's a federal response, looking at, you know, federally managed lands. By law, they can really only look at federal lands. There's a few times where they can squeak out and look beyond that, but it's pretty rare. And anyways, they do emergency assessment before final containment. So those bear teams are brought in just before you hit that 100% containment, and they start looking at, you know, what are the risks to life and infrastructure and also cultural resources? Are there things that need to be done to be protected, particularly in the immediate, you know, really they're looking in the next, you know, 30 to maybe 120 days that they want to try and get practices put on the ground that will help protect those critical risks. They are not looking at long-term restoration. They're not counting fences that need to be rebuilt or you know, general hillsides that may or may not need to be replanted. You know, they're not looking at commercial tree replanting, things like that. So they look at those high priority risks and identify and develop the practices that will help mitigate those threats. So we had looked in 2014 of having the federal team also cover the state and private lands, because in that fire it was about 65% state and private lands, and that's when we learned that they couldn't. So I opened my big fat mouth and said, well, can we put a couple of members on your team to just kind of follow you guys around, and we can learn how to do it, and then we'll kind of pick them and choose how we can handle ours. Excuse me. So long story short, the Federal Forest Service in this case, they got a hold of FEMA. FEMA came to us and said, would you be interested in developing your own bear team? And we were like, you know, sure, why not? We're crazy enough. Let's do this. So we put together a state and private bear team. It was an interagency team, so that's why we call it an iBear. And you know, it took a lot of pre-team coordination. It was agreements with various other agencies and organizations that could provide us with the technical staff that we needed to be able to pull this off. Then you have to go around and develop a burned area reflectance class. It's satellite photography, but you have to have access to it and also know how to process it through GIS. It basically looks at pre-fire and post-fire changes to vegetation. And from that, it can kind of give you a general idea of how severely one area burned compared to another. That's kind of the beginning of going out and doing your soil burn severity. And that also has a huge impact on post-fire hydrology, which we'll get to also in a little bit. So anyways, then we assembled our team. Really, we're looking for red carded folks in 14 and in 15 when we put our team together. They did not have red cards. It's something we are trying to work on even now, is to be able to get people to have red cards. They're a little bit more difficult to get handed out to somebody, you know, as Steve said, you know, who doesn't carry a gun or a hose. It's really hard to get those cards in a lot of cases. So it's one of those things that we're still trying to work on. And then finally, you know, coordinate with federal and tribal teams. You know, when we had our bear team working in 2015, we were working with 2 different federal bear teams because there was so much area burn. They brought in 2 teams. Plus there was a tribal team. We burnt onto the Colville Confederated Tribes Reservation and trying to collaborate with theirs. They have their own bear team. So there was 4 bear teams working 500,000 acres in 2015. So it takes a lot of that coordination. And finally, somebody's got to go after the dollars. These teams are not inexpensive. We found that on average, we've put together a bear team about 4 or 5 times now. The average cost is somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000 per team per incident, because you're paying for travel costs, staff time, lodging, meals per diem, things like that, plus additional other expenses. So they're not inexpensive. They shouldn't be taken lightly as far as deciding when and where to implement them. So what does a bear team include? The most important things are what I call the ISS, which are soil scientists, engineers, hydrologists, GIS specialists, archaeologists, biologists, and then a team lead. And the team lead's usually one of the other aforementioned scientists. Our experience, we had a soil scientist on staff in 14 and 15. So she was the de facto team lead. But that position is really important because they have to help kind of make sure everybody's getting their work done, but also coordinating with a lot of the other folks that are working on around you and along with you. So there's a lot of roles there that need to be done. And then I was supporting the team in trying to help them get resources they needed so that they could continue doing their work. So this is what our 2015 team looked like. These are all of the agencies and organizations that comprised our team. You can see a lot of federal agencies. There were seven federal agencies. There was 1 tribe. There was 3 state agencies and 5 conservation districts. Those were the organizations that were involved. We actually had several people. There was 3 conservation districts that sent us 2 people each. So we had a good number of people. It was a larger than average bear team, especially compared to like federal teams. They tend to try and keep them 9 to 12 members. But part of ours too was, frankly, we were also trying to get train up other staff because being hit back-to-back years, we just felt like we needed to get more people in on learning how this type of effort is done. So moving on, one of the things you really want to be considerate of is team safety. They're going out in an active fire. You have to coordinate with your incident command, but you need to make sure that they understand what those pitfalls are. Loose, unstable slopes, burned out tree trunks and things like that can make for hot ember fire pits. There's just a lot of things that they have to really be watching out for. So you really have to stress safety for folks. Here's a photo of our 2015 team examining a very highly, a very hot burn portion of the fire. These folks are doing long hour work. When we bring our teams together, we tell them that they're going to work anywhere on average from 14 to 16 hours per day, usually 9 to 12 days in a row with no days off. It is hot work. It's still 80 plus, sometimes 90 plus degrees in our area when these fires are occurring. And you have to wear full protective gear and PPE. So it's uncomfortable to say the least. But it is really important stuff because the stuff that they identify can help protect and save lives. So one of the things that we have to do before we even put the team out in the field is we have to get landowner permissions. That's one of the things, that's the nice thing that federal agencies have when they're focused on federal lands. They don't have to do that because they already manage the lands that they're going to go look at. In our case, state agencies, it can be relatively easy. They're usually pretty on board, especially if they have members on the team with us. But getting private landowners, many of whom have, just lost everything. They've lost their home. Maybe they've lost, key parts of their farm, or it's just, they've lost their little piece of paradise that they've been, hoping to retire on someday. They're really hurt, and it can be difficult at times to get access. The other thing is, not everybody uses a landline anymore. Fewer and fewer people are. So looking somebody up in the phone book is almost impossible. It's not even worth trying, hardly. So even just trying to reach out to those folks can be a real challenge. So anyways, that's a big part of this. It takes a lot of pre-agents or pre-bear team work to do that. But then, once the team gets started, they're taking that that burned area reflectance class map, the BARC map, and they go out and they start looking at sites and saying, that the map says that this is a high severity burn. Is it a high severity burn? And they start doing the ground truthing, and they make little tweaks to it. And they say, well, this isn't really high severity. Yeah, we lost a lot of leaves and everything else, but it's not really high severity. The soil didn't get damaged as much. And so they start making corrections to that map. And while they're out there, they're also looking for values at risk. These are like bridges and other public infrastructure items. They could be homes. They could be irrigation dams. People have dams for regulating reservoirs for their irrigation, things like that could be at risk if there's a post-wildfire flood or debris flow or things like that. While that's all going on, as soon as they get the soil burn severity pretty close to being done, then they start doing hydrologic modeling, to try and see, okay, if we start having some rain events and things like that, what are we anticipating getting? Are we going to get a lot of debris and material out of a particular watershed? Is it going to just come off as a flash flood? What kind of things can we anticipate? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that's all going on. And then they sit down the last couple of days, the team is working and they start developing the recommended practices. What are the things that they're going to recommend? Do we do seeding in this upper watershed? Do we start building some barriers to try and divert potential flash floods away from critical infrastructure, things like that? They start identifying all those things that they're going to need to do that really should be a priority for various agencies to focus on over the next few weeks and months. And then we do public outreach. We do a public meeting and let people know this is what we found. These were the areas that were the highest severity burns. These are the areas that you really need to watch out for. These are areas that you need to watch out for, but maybe it's less concern, to try and give some people, an understanding of kind of what's going on out there. And then finally, a lot of coordination with emergency management. You got to be talking to your local emergency management folks all the time. I mean, daily. Yeah, kind of giving them an update of what you're finding and what you're not finding. So this is kind of an example. This was in 2014. The fire was still raging, and we had a thunderstorm, and it dropped about 3/4 of an inch of rain in the upper portions of this watershed. I think it's I want to say it's a 12,000 acre watershed or ish, relatively small. But because of how severely that watershed was burned, it had a lot of fuels in that watershed, steep slopes and whatnot. It had a lot of high severity burn area in there. So that 3/4 of an inch of rain, which was a little bit less than a 10-year flood event type rain for us, it created a 1,000-year flood. So that's what the impact of burn soils have. It's just like pouring water across plastic. It just runs right off. Just upstream of that last picture, this is a dam. This is one of those irrigating regulating reservoirs, and it failed. The earthen dam failed. It contributed certainly to the flood that was seen around that house, because there was a whole lot more water that was released in addition to the rainfall. So those are things that you start to realize that trying to do these assessments and get them done quickly can be really, really critical. So some of the things that we looked at doing was trying to get those announcements out to people to let them know when the risk of catastrophic flooding or whatever was done. So working with our Washington Department of Ecology, the National Weather Service, we were able to put 14 rain gauges out in 2014 and then another 5 in 2015. Excuse me, these were necessary because we are in kind of a pretty remote area of our state, far from any National Weather Service radar. So it was very difficult for them to be able to give us a real effective kind of pre-storm warnings for thunderstorms and things like that causes the types of events that we have to be concerned with. So we were able to put these out and do it for far cheaper than kind of what the then technology was going to charge us. So these gauges are actually former stream gauges. They just took the end off and put a rain bucket on it instead. And it sends an emergency alert signal to the National Weather Service and Department of Ecology and our county emergency management if it ever records 0.05 of an inch of rain in 5 minutes or less. So, and they're still out there to this day. So they're still providing us some level of protection, even 5, 6, 7 years after the fires. The other thing that we identified was the need to protect certain homes. There were some that were at a much higher risk. We actually identified 45 homes that were at risk, and about 17 of them took us up on an offer to have these structures built. This was in partnership with NRCS. This is an EWP dike. And this one was, I believe this dike is 900 feet long. And so it's a lot of rock. It was actually, this was built in the spring of 2015 and was actually tested in the spring of 2016. It did breach partially, actually just downstream of the house that's in this picture, but the house was protected. We were able to repair and actually kind of strengthen the dike that following year. So finally, last couple of slides here. What are the kind of differences between bear response and a rehab response? And I want to say our district was involved in both. We did far more rehab work than we did bear work, but bear was kind of a unique thing since it was kind of a first of its kind for state and private lands. But this table kind of gives you an example of that difference. Bear is immediate now, got to have a response to try and protect critical infrastructure and life and safety. Rehab is getting the watershed back up functioning better and sooner over a longer period of time. So there is a distinct difference, and I think a lot of people have a misinterpretation that bear then will inform rehab, and it does to some limited extent, but not to a real big extent. Probably the biggest tool out of bear team that rehab can use is some of the soil burn severity, because then you can start to see some of the areas that you may need to have more focus for replanting or things like that down the road. So some of the barriers to be able to do this type of work going forward is recognition and acceptance of local government technical skills. In 2014, when we were asked if we could do this, it was kind of almost tongue-in-cheek. The folks at FEMA were, well, can you get these specialists together and we'll call you back in 3 days. And when they called back in 3 days, and we had 17 or 19 people or whatever it was that all met those criteria, they were shocked. They really didn't think that we had that kind of depth of people we could bring to the fight. So I think that's a big part of it. Conservation districts have exceptionally talented staff, and I think it's just some recognition from the big agencies would go a long ways to kind of helping bring us on board. Cost reimbursement for actions. Most of us are grant funded. Very few of us have the dollars to be able to pull these things off. I would not have been able to do ours. We would not have been able to do ours if it wasn't for an agreement from our state to reimburse us for those costs, and FEMA helping us out that first year. And then finally, development of the bear teams. You need specialists that know specific skills. I mean, you can have a hydrologist that doesn't know how to do bear because they don't know exactly what they're looking for or what they're supposed to be doing. So it doesn't take a lot of really specific training, but it does take some. And then pre-disaster coordination and training. That's making sure that they have the training. They also have the red card training if at all possible. Also having coordination, have agreements in place so that you can bring the teams together. And then finally, there's a kind of a tool, a menu list that incident commanders use to bring, that they're given by state emergency management. These are the tools that are available to you for your incident that you may call upon if you need. And for federal fires, they can bring in a bear team. But when it starts to look at state and private lands, they don't have anything on that menu list. And so trying to get a bear team recognized for state and private lands in states, and then be able to call them out for that would be really critical. So that's what I have. I went through it really fast. I'm sorry about that, but happy to answer questions when it's time.
Thank you for that insightful presentation about bear teams, Craig. It's given us all a lot to consider. So it's now time for our Q&A and guided session led by Ann Walker. So I'll hand it over to you, Ann.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to all the speakers in this panel. I have a subdued sense of excitement, I'm afraid, just because, I helped evacuate a friend that actually lived right across from Lisa's new office during the Labor Day fires last year. And so it does hit home to me. And Steve, when you talk about your, friends and family and neighborhoods being impacted on this, I hear it. And I know that it's really disconcerting. It's hard to see all your years of experience into working with your communities and the landscapes and your neighbors and the families that have kids that went to school with your kids, really frustrated because they don't necessarily know what's going on. And so I think, again, this panel is super important. We did have some questions in the chat, and there a couple of them were answered during the presentation, but I'll go down through those first. And then I have some of my own that I want to go back and to try to, I'll probably roll into the next Q&A session, which we have scheduled from 2 to 3 Mountain, 1 to 2 Pacific. But I want to blend this because I really think the conversation needs to be had about what the solid actions are coming away from this summit, and how to move forward within NACD and with the partners that we've had on the summit today and talking with us. I hope that several of them are still on and can join in on the conversation. If not, we certainly have paths to follow up with them. And Katie Lighthall had to jump off with the coordinator position for the regional committee. She's definitely one that I urge everyone to stay connected with, and she had put her information in the chat. So that is a huge open door with Katie to anybody, any organization that you need help from, or that you want to ask questions, or you need tips and tools. So with that, I will go through the chat. So first we had Steve, I appreciated your question. Is the portal available for other state conservation district associations? Lowell or Chris, did you want to add to that and maybe share some examples of stuff that you have in other states that might be available?
Sure. Yeah, we're still working on it with Deb. I know that she has been working with NRCS and the state con about whether other folks could get into it or not. I think the big limitation for most states is that a lot of the work we did in terms of like creating veg departure layers, while the methodology is there, like we don't have it for the state of California, we didn't do it for Oregon, Washington, et cetera. But it is using, national data, available data sets. It's using Landfire and NRCS soils data and ecological sites and all these, wildfire risk data we have for the whole West. So while the recipe in the cookbook is there, the data aren't always there for all those different states. But Deb would have to ask specifically about exactly, who can get in and who can't. So I'll have her follow up with Steve on that.
Okay. Is there a web link or anything that you could put into the chat? Or maybe you already have, and I just haven't gotten to it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can send you, I'll send you some follow-up collateral that you can send out to the group on sort of the portal and the project. And we worked with, I think I saw Mike Beacom on here. Yeah, he's on here. We did work with him and his staff and wrote up a little sort of one-pager description about the project and, how it relates. But no, I am very, I like, Craig's talk in Washington. I do a lot of work with state forestry there and shared stewardship, and I do a lot of work with CAL FIRE and all those folks, and I'm constantly trying to break down the walls between FEMA funding, getting it down to people on the ground, where these communities at risk are, where these shared stewardship priorities are. Yeah, I'm spending a lot of personal investment and time to break those walls down and solve all those problems, and would love to see conservation districts at the table a whole lot more than sometimes they are. So
I appreciate that comment, Lowell. It really is important to engage with conservation districts, and as you can see from the presentations today, that they do have the relationships with the local landowners and can add a lot of value to the conversations about assessing risks and where there's patches of opposition to government and don't want to talk to anybody, or you have a landowner that's willing, because that often will make or break your whole project, and we've experienced that. So thank you, Lowell. I definitely had one thing that I wanted to touch on, and that was, I really felt like you had dialed in the fact that we needed to have progress in the whole country. We needed to touch on the shared stewardship silos and try to break those down. So anything that you can do to try to
Correct.
help us with that, I think is greatly appreciated.
Yeah. And those are initiatives, you know, that are, you know, they were put forth by, you know, USDA, you know, when Sonny Perdue was there, you know, that was his sort of mantra was, you know, shared stewardship. And a lot of that emanated from there. And I didn't see Keisha's actually on. I didn't realize she was on, but yeah, I'm super bullish on what's happening in Arizona. I think their head's in an awesome place. I think it's a model for how to, you know, do collaborative landscape scale planning and just, you know, and pictures worth 1,000 words and a map's worth 1,000 pictures. And, you know, I've sat in way too many meetings with, you know, people trying to whiteboard and pictures and crayon drawings and you know, you have a very hard time telling your story and without, you know, good data. So.
I think that's really important over my years of working on the Hill or working with governors and state foresters and others. It's very obvious that, you know, money is hard to come by and you're competing against your neighbor. And so the more that you can do to build that partnership so you're not, you know, competing against them, but bringing them to the table, and then you show that effectiveness and work on the ground together, I think that really moves you, you know, to a higher priority, and you have, you know, more success of getting funded on things. Yeah. I've heard a lot about grant projects and stuff for all this, and having written grant criteria for the Pacific Northwest and our coordinating group here, you know, we added in a point structure so that you'd have projects that were funded that had a biomass utilization component. Right. It's a big piece of the puzzle here, and we utilize that material. So it was effective in doing it, but gosh, we saw so many different groups competing against themselves, and they all are really good and they all need the money, but we just have to figure out ways to do things, you know, smarter, not harder. And I think the data is definitely the piece and one of the paths to get on to get there. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah. So Heidi Ramsey, are you still on? I wanted to say, if she's not, she put a comment in the chat about NRCS has EWPP funding available for technical and financial assistance after an event. So one of my follow-up actions will be to reach out to Heidi and find out if she can share some of that information with us. Next, thank you, Lori, for putting the link to a really great short video that is from Steve and Sierra RCD. It really is worthwhile watching it. If folks have a problem accessing it, there's also, I plan to put that on the event website along with some other documents that you had some problems with, but no worries. The same goes with you, Lisa. There was a great flyer that you guys had put together for Clackamas Soil and Water that was about that fire preparedness session that you had. I think that's a really good tool for a conservation district that doesn't have the time or energy, you know, really to put something together like that, or it's intimidating to do a graphic design on something. It's perfect. You can come up with it and change the names, you know. I think, thank you so much for that as well. And I'll get that available to folks. If others on here have tools or flyers or such that you've used in your area, you know, like the mapping and stuff, Craig, that you used with Bear and talking about e-tarts that was done in Clackamas, any of those types of examples, please feel free to share either in the chat or later with me, and I'll be sure to get that to folks. Jeff Morset asked, was there any fire incident command systems in place? Seems like incident command systems or ICS can help with this type of confusion and underutilization of resources. And Steve and Lori, I know that was directly to during your talk. Did you want to take that, Steve or Lori?
So this is Lori. And I'll try to respond to that. All wildfires in the state have utilize the ICS system, whether it's CAL FIRE, lead fire, or a Forest Service BLM or federally led fire. So I can't speak specifically to Steve's situation, but I would assume as the fire went from a type 3 to a type 2 to a type 1, when a GAC was called in, that a lot got lost in the translation in terms of who was doing what, who was available to do what. And I think that's kind of where the action item or the recommendation that I made about these delegations of authorities as the incident management team changes, certain things need to follow along. And RCDs is one of the things, and the role that RCDs can play is one of the things that can need to follow along.
Yeah, from my perspective, it was, we were told we couldn't participate in the response itself. However, on the recovery side and what that quote chain of command was, we were able to follow that. We could on a voluntary basis participate. And so we did take advantage of that. And that became an opportunity to talk about what is an RCD. And pretty soon we were taking field tours with Cal OES, FEMA, Cal Recycle, their contractors, and they started to talk about debris phases, debris removal phase 1, hazardous household materials, where you have to do PPE, and then phase 2, debris removal, being structural remnants and ash. And then we looked at what was called phase 3. We're looking at how do you look at the watershed with our internal GIS organization. We were able to start to look at things in a different way, as well as strategically. But if you're talking about the range, since it was winter time, we had to prepare, so storm readiness. And we did work with a lot of landowners, neighborhood associations, started to do the things, the sandbags, the wattles, the rice straw, the whole gamut. So we took it from there, you could say.
Right. I might add, my history with working with incident management teams, and again, like Lori to reiterate, when it goes to a type 1, or even when it transitions from a team because they've been there long enough that they just need to bring in another group, they've been there maybe 14 days. A lot gets lost in translation, I guess, or it walks out the door when the folks have timed out and they have to go home and go back to their day job. And that is something that I think I've heard since the day I was, working on fire dispatch at 15 years old. It seems that the local landowner and their history with the land seems to get overlooked, and does get overlooked often with firefighters that come in from out of the area. And Steve, like you talked about, where that's great that you have all of these resources doing all kinds of things to help you in your time of need, but they go home too, and they came in not knowing who you are, not knowing who the players are. So I really think in our actions that we move forward, we really look at what you've brought up with, that delegation of authority. One of the things that I want to follow up on is that one of the co-chairs for the regional committee that Katie coordinates, Joe Stetler is a co-chair of that group, and he is part of the area commander structure for incident management teams. I definitely think this is something that we need to identify as a follow-up action, and we'll reach back out to Katie to try to organize some type of conversation with Joe and identify further actions to try to address that. Thank you very much. So Aster, I am just now taking a look at your comment, and you'd like to add some information on damage survey teams post-fire. Are you still on with us? Yes.
I'm still with you, Ann. I'm still with you.
Thank
So,
you, Astor. Thank you.
so Craig had did a great presentation. Appreciate that, Craig. And he was talking about bear teams, and the connection with that with our staff there works well. And there is a role with that, especially on the federal side. But somebody may ask about private side. So from our perspective, our damage survey teams are the ones that are looking at, I'll say USDA, those local private individuals working their land. It's not only NRCS, but FSA with some of their practices. And that's where we try to coordinate. And then there's overlap with FEMA and other entities there as well. So you have this structure to where the best way, and I know a lot of the states and bad teams and all the partners out there have these here annual or monthly types of meetings that they're talking about, this here kind of they have a process in place, but also the post, what are we doing? How can we pull things together and have some dialogue with folks where a lot of times it's one location in the county where everybody can come to and hear from all of the federal entities on what they're bringing to the table. And that's where we can get the information to folks and try to clarify something. At that time, it's rough. No matter what you've lost, it's a loss. And when we can pull things together, share folks with them about, from the agricultural side to private land side, this is what we do. But that also there's a connection. And when that question, that point Heidi was raising, on not only our Watershed particular program, which a lot of our sponsors are those county officials, and depending on the location of the fire, you have the nexus between private and public landscapes. And some of our practices and structures, we are partnered with Forest Service or BLM to do some work together and jointly on that particular aspect. But that's what Heidi was linking it for, because we can actually, depending on what the damage survey report shows us, we'll look at, it could be EQIP as one of the programs that we can utilize to go back and help folks reestablish some fencing, pipelines or something like that. The Watershed program is more for that land, that erosion factor where, you get a burn scar and the monsoon season hits. Well, if you're not protecting that with either some type of mulching or structures that are going to hold and capture that material and not let it rush down the drainage way, then you're going to have major problems after that. So that's where we have that nexus and that link. And like I said, Craig did a great job on, appreciate what he was saying, but we're all working together and trying to improve that. Not all, CAL FIRE does a great job. I know Carlos, our state conservationist in that group, they're always talking and everything. Then I think we can do a better job with other states to where we have those teams talking earlier and often. And because a lot of times when the fire is going and you're trying to pull people together, then you're going to be set back, So if we can do a better job on the front side, we can actually have that much more success. Just want to add that piece to it. Thank you.
I'm really glad that you did, Astor. So does that start like, when I was listening to Lisa talking about reaching out to her NRCS state forester, is that a conversation that the state forestry agency, state forester, not to be confused with the NRCS state forester, is that conversation at that level, how does that really come together in areas where, guess what, they don't always talk?
Yeah, and that's something that ties in with this whole process we're doing. Our state conservationists play such a key role. I know we have a few of them on right now. I know Keisha's on in Arizona. She has connections there with the state foresters. So that's what the expectation is, that they have that connection. And because it's not only with fires or things, but it's a lot of times, the forest stewardship plans and things that landowners have, that we work with our state forest to help us out, because we don't have all the staff that we need in that realm of foresters. And so we rely on our partners. And then she has a connection with the federal group as well. I try to have engagement from this regional level with the regional foresters from time to time, but sometimes it's a hit and miss, but we all got to improve that process. But I really rely and expect the state conservationists to have that reach to those foresters, those state foresters there, the connection and all the other entities there locally within that state, where the communication is happening, and then we're sharing information about particular programs, how we can help address these resource concerns and any post activities of from these disasters.
That sounds really good, Aster. Thank you so much. And next up, Tyre, I see you're on here and I absolutely love your question. And it's perfect timing. What kind of fiscal instruments are used for non-federal bear teams so all that can are able to participate? If I can, Craig, would you give us just a little bit of an update with your connections with George Geisler and how you did some funding for those?
Sure. So we actually got our funding for our 14 or 15 teams through the Washington State Conservation Commission. And then they got basically they took funding that was meant for grants for other districts and just reappropriated it to us. So we basically stole from other conservation districts, at least temporarily, which isn't cool. It was not my intent, but they did it because they recognized that this was a major need. And so, and we did provide a bear team for another conservation district upon request in 2015, but that money was then backfilled by the Washington State Legislature. They backfilled those expenses, plus giving additional funds then, because we had that information, we were able to take to legislative leadership in the governor's office and say, look, here's this list of things that need to be done, in addition to some of the recovery things that were identified. And so, we went from, I think in 14, we started with an original appropriation to do not only stuff like the bear team, but also do some of the initial assessments. Our funding package was about $180,000. And so we did that first bear team with those funds. And then we were able to get upwards of close to $1.2 million then the following spring from the legislature. Those dollars were for recovery, et cetera, for 14, not having any inkling that we would need dollars for that coming summer, but we still had some of those funds available. So we used those for the recovery actions in 15 as well. So we were kind of covering 2 years of fire with those funds. But then the following spring, then the legislature said, this is a really big problem. And they appropriated $6.7 million. Across the state for fire recovery and backfilling those expenses. So really what I would say is that it takes a lot of conversations with people. I spent a lot of time on the road. It's a 5-hour drive to our state capitol from our office. I'd made that trip many times, talking to our Office of Financial Management, the governor's office, legislators, a whole host of people. It takes a lot of time and it's a risk, but it's also a risk to apply for a grant. So, it's a different risk. But, if you can show them the numbers, most legislators, when they start seeing spreadsheets of data that you've gone and talked to 200 landowners, 500 landowners, however many it is, and these are the needs, it's really hard for them to turn away from that. So, and real quick, I will also say that I've been having follow-up conversations with George Geisler, who's our Washington State Forester with the Department of Natural Resources, about making our bear team a standing team, if you will, that it would be then recognized. It would be in that menu of items that incident command teams could have at their fingertips. It's just been a long process, and just getting the resources, because I have a conservation district to be the director of. There's a few other things I'm dealing with, a lot of other issues, and so as time allows, been working on trying to come up with the strategy and the structure of how a interagency bear team would be developed and funded and managed and things like that. So they are definitely open to it. They really are excited about going forward with something along those lines. It's just a matter of getting the resources together to figure out all the moving parts. So
that sounds good, Craig. Thank you so much. I do have that down as an action to follow up with George Geisler. I believe he is the chair of the National Association of State Foresters Fire Committee right now. And so it definitely is a step in the right direction to identifying the, skill sets of conservation district staff that, could easily be red carded and easily become part of that team. there's a lot behind getting those red cards and being available for dispatch per se to the neighboring districts. And at this point, every fire committee meeting I've ever participated in, or any of the National Fire Center managers type meetings in Boise, have always been that there's a shortage of qualified people in positions. We have to think outside the box of the normal traditional partners when we're looking for capacity building and surge capacity. So I think that's a great recommendation to move forward. I'm heading back to Tyre. Did we really answer your question? Did that help as far as fiscal instruments and covering the legislature, backfill districts? Not seeing you on here now. Maybe I think he just left. So moving on down, Keisha's on. The decision on legal accessibility to private information has not yet been decided. And Heidi, thanks for adding that in, that she had her hand raised. My apologies, I missed it. And apparently the mic was not working again. I'm sorry, Heidi. Is it working now? No. Okay, down to Marine Tobert. Sorry if I'm butchering that one. We are involved in both pre and post fire activities at our RCD in Northern California. If you want to learn more about what an RCD can do for local communities, check out this link to our 2020 annual report. So there's a nice tool in the toolbox there for folks in the chat. And then thank you for letting me know, Corey, that Tyre had to jump on another call. All right. I think that's the end of the comments in the chat box. Rachel, did I miss anything on there?
Not that I can see.
Okay. All right. And Danielle Oakes, thanks very much from the Council of Western State Foresters and the Western Forest Leadership Coalition, said that George is the current NASF Fire Committee Chair, as well as our State Forester Liaison for the Council of Western State Foresters and the Western State Fire Managers. So thank you very much, Danielle. I appreciate that. If you're on, I would certainly open up your mic if you're wanting to share a little bit about the Western States fire managers or the Council of Western State Fire Managers, if you're interested.
Oh, nothing more to add on this particular conversation. Just wanted to make that connection kind of between him being both the NASF Fire Chair as well as the liaison on the Western Fire Managers, which represent all the Western states, the FMOs, fire supervisors, et cetera, for all 17 Western states and 6 Pacific Islands.
Very good. Thank you, Danielle. And if there's anything that any link that you could put into the chat that would help folks to guide them to their state forester or your organization, please feel free to do so. I think that would be really helpful. All right, not seeing any more questions in the chat. I want to definitely go back to Rachel. Thank you very much for moderating this fantastic panel, and thank you very much to the speakers. I really appreciate your lending your expertise and recommendations and actions and the things that you've gone through. And I wish you the best of luck this year. And if you have any questions or follow up with me, please feel free to reach out. All right, I'm going to move into the last part of our agenda for today, and that is a Q&A session, identifying post-summit actions. And then I've also included a bit of a policy update from our DC policy folks, and then a final wrap up for the day. So I would like to open it up for folks if you have any questions about the previous panels. Give it just a second so folks can chime in if they wish. I know during the Wyoming session, and Rob, I see that you're still on here. In Wyoming, you talked about the partnerships, and I was really happy that you had the State Fire Marshal's office on there and Kathy Clay. And I think it's important because I didn't necessarily see that we had a big component of that in the attendees on our session today, being that they are the focal point for structural protection. I know they do a lot to add in building fire adapted communities plans or CWPPs. What might you suggest for folks on here for conservation districts to partner with the state fire marshal for their area?
Yeah, thank you, Ann. So as I understand, the question is, how can conservation districts partner more closely with, the case of Kathy, she's with the local fire district, serves as the fire marshal for one area within the state. I guess in our case, part of our partnership has just been overlap in careers, just working together over the course of time in wildland fire incidents and getting to know the diverse skills, resources, people that come together on those wildland fires and then branch into other careers, and we run into down the road, and some of those relationships come more easily because of that past history. Our fire marshal really heads up the prevention bureau in this area, and so has a staff of fire inspectors, is responsible for overseeing the building code, so the regulated work as folks are developing and remodeling homes. And they often are willing to come to conservation districts as a incentive-based entity that these landowners can work with, while they are approaching things from more of a regulatory end. So kind of a carrot and a stick relationship of, Kathy's going to tell you what you have to do as you develop in our mapped wildland urban interface, but you can come to the conservation district that has no cost, no obligation resources to look at both your structure and vegetation and help fund that work being implemented. So having resources available to help them along with their needs or their requirements. Just another example of what our conservation district is offering is a road corridor management program. So where we have a subdivision or neighborhood scale private road, we will come out and just take a look at the conditions of that road, compare it to National Fire Protection Association standards, and then give recommendations and financial incentives to bring that up to a higher standard to improve people's ability to evacuate, and as well as first responders' ability to ingress and egress an area safely. So that, in our case, hasn't been a hard relationship to cultivate. I think capacity regularly comes up as we identify just the myriad and complexity of topics that can and maybe should be dealt with, and can feel a little overwhelming as we look at just all the facets of this wildfire risk reduction challenge. And I think some good planning of really what is our priority or our priorities, focusing on that as many other things come at us continuously, information, grant opportunities, ideas that others have successfully implemented, and trying to be realistic with the resources we have to make constructive impacts.
Mm-hmm. Rob, thank you so much on that, because I have to say, in my experience with evacuation, what I've seen in helping all the counties in the state of Oregon work on their community wildfire protection plan in my previous career, it was very obvious that the local landowners were communicating with each other prior to Facebook, just saying that how do you know who has a trailer that can haul 15 goats and 6 horses, and when it's a wind-driven fire, people are still going to try to save their animals and be in harm's way. And I've witnessed in the numerous conferences and such, story after story, where people die trying to evacuate, more so than anything. And when you talk about roads and assessing those for access and egress, I think it hits home to me that a lot of the FireWise principles just don't necessarily get implemented or applied in some of the areas that all these homes are being built. And yet people expect to have fire service or expect the local municipal services don't necessarily come along with where they're wanting to build. Is that kind of what you're seeing as well in Wyoming?
Sure. Yeah, I think we've got only a recent history of land planning and zoning requirements, really starting at the town level and then expanding to the county. So that's for Teton County. Other areas in the state have really very little in the way of county controlled zoning that requires that road configuration planning or vegetation management on a new subdivision.
Right.
I think one of the resources that I'd really compliment Megan and NFPA on is a document called Safer from the Start. And that can be used prior to development of a subdivision in looking at that opportunity to address those wildfire risk reduction issues. And then it can also be used as a tool to look at an already developed subdivision where you may have covenants or CC&Rs in place, and looking at ways to make specific examples of language that can be used, and whether you want it to be more regulatory or more just informational, but tremendous resource to help guide landowners along if they're looking at making changes at that scale.
Okay, that sounds great. I made a note on that to reach back out to Megan in case she's not on still. That's a great idea. I've seen plans that have been developed on evacuating animals, and I just think that really hits home to our conservation districts with the management of their livestock and cow-calf operations that we've heard about in from Keith and others today. And those, so I appreciate your input on that. And if anyone else has anything to share about that, I know Sarah, I kind of maybe want to hit on you if you're willing to talk a little bit about how you've worked in North Dakota and the relationships between the forestry agencies and conservation districts. Not to throw you on live here, Sarah, but if you're available, I would love to have your input. She might not be able to, looks like. All right. Anyone else want to share anything about the previous sessions? All right. Not seeing anything in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and jump to identifying post-summit actions. And I have somewhat of a bit of a list. I've been trying to keep track as I've been listening to what folks are saying, and we'll butcher these, I'm sure, but it'll be kind of a lightning round of trying to go through these. And I would like to have folks chime in if there's something that you could, maybe if I missed something that we definitely need to include to move this forward and really have a solid, strong list of actions following up from this summit to help accelerate the goals of the cohesive strategy and to help your communities and any funding and capacity building that you may need. So in the first Cohesive Strategy 101 session, I really felt a follow-up action on that from the local level is that we hope that you engage with the regional strategy committee coordinators. In the West here, it's Katie, any of the people that are on there, we definitely want to encourage that. So Katie has put that link in there. one of the things that I am also working on for the National Association of Conservation Districts is a desk guide, and there will be a resource guide for you as a conservation district to go to and identify some of the tips and tools or resources, some of the background foundational documents, where to go for help, examples of, you know, projects that have happened within each goal area, but more primarily to the region of the West. It'll also be broken down for this particular area of the country. At the state level, I think the action is really in the hands of some of the Association of Conservation Districts and their folks. And Rachel, I think where you were talking about some of the work that you've done in Colorado, I think reaching out between the state foresters and the state cons and the state conservation district folks would be a really good place to do that. My apologies, I don't know that there maybe there already is a network that brings those folks to the table, to as well as to the Department of Interior and the bureaus, as well as NRCS. Anything to add about that? Does that sound like something you're already doing or could enhance? Looks like it's not coming off mute for you. Dang. And I just see a note in chat from Danielle that she had to step out for a call, and I was talking about states, but we'll connect back up with her. Rachel, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
Gosh darn technology.
I know.
No, that sounds, you summarized that well, Anne, and I think I also want to point out some of the work that obviously the forestry RPG is already doing to connect everybody within those networks. I think that's really a valuable tool that they've been offering to states around the country.
Very good. With that, Rachel, I appreciate that answer. Mike Beacom, is there anything that you would like to add at this point on that?
I mean, you mentioned Colorado. Obviously, the joint forestry team brings some of those groups together. And so in Colorado, the state con there, Clint Evans, has a good working relationship with Mike Lester, and Clint's forester, Jonas Feinstein. Those group work together and have regular conversation. The joint forestry team really tries to foster those relationships among our four organizations so that they can, communicate not just on wildfire, but on forest management and a host of issues.
Right. Does it get to the level, do the conversations get to the level of specific needs on coordination for, say, grant funding to groups to help with, like evacuation, education, something like that?
It certainly can. We're taking direction from leadership. And so for the agencies, the two chiefs and our two presidents for state foresters and conservation districts. But really, we're looking at a number of things. And then from there, trying to offer guidance back up the chain on how things can work better at the ground level and also at the state level.
Gotcha. Okay. I appreciate that. Because I think a lot of the areas, even like in Clackamas County, where Lisa was talking about, there's one road, and on the south side of the road, the state forestry boundary ends. And then on the north side of the road, they're not there. And so you don't have the state forestry component of, connection to the state government, especially when it comes to programs like Firewise, which why it was so important in Clackamas that they had developed their own fire awareness program and helped in those areas. So thank you on that, Mike. I hope that the conversation can continue, and that guidance would be one that comes down to help with landowners that are not necessarily in the state state jurisdiction that, you know, also have problems with evacuating animals and trying to get out, or education about like ready, set, go for a farm, or firewise on the farm, or fire tools. Okay, down into panel 1 and really talking about Wyoming. I liked a couple of things that we didn't cover on, Rob, and I'm not sure if Mike Hen is still on, but I hope so. We talked about the insurance industry, and as far as actions, what would you think, and I open this to everybody, not just Wyoming, but what do you think the next action would be to engage with local insurance industry or state insurance business, you know, folks?
And this is Mike. You know, we haven't engaged in my part of Wyoming with insurance companies. I think a lot of it has to do, we've had this conversation on the side, but I think a lot of it has to do with, we just don't have the population centers. You know, we're not like California and some others that have had large WUI fires, you know, that have consumed entire communities. So I think that they just haven't come to the table, and Rob's got a different experience with Teton County and Jackson specifically, but I think in Sublette County and most of Wyoming, we don't have a population base that they tend to engage often yet. Like we said, times are changing, and that might mean down the road that they will come to the table and engage. But from my aspect, that's my take on it. Rob, I know you've got some other experience.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that was informative. Even county to county, we can have some large differences in cases. I think a step we took about 5 or 6 years ago is reached out to every single local insurer with some letters, introductory letter as to what our TOPAC Wildfire Coalition was. And essentially what we said was, we see that you and us have the same clients. You've got these homeowners who you're trying to insure, who you are trying to promote a safe environment around. We also want to be working with those people to look at conditions on the ground and to improve their safety. And why don't we get together and get an understanding of, say, the recommendations you would be making to improve safety, and look at the recommendations we're making, see if we're on the same page. That was a really slow start. My next door neighbor is a Farm Bureau agent, and so that was the one seat we had at the table initially, was speaking with them and slowly starting to develop some rapport. We've also invited the insurance industry to that Teton Area Wildfire Protection Coalition, and have had 2 participants in that. That's really, I think, speaks to what a lot of folks have talked about today, was strengthening those relationships ahead of incidents or problems or more severe situations. So we're getting a better idea of what each other does and can or can't do. And insurance has been really helpful in communicating to us, and that, you know, even sweeping changes that are occurring. One of our insurance brokers, you know, recently informed us that multiple major insurers were dropping large areas of our county from coverage. And there really isn't a lot of room for negotiation based on things like treatment in the home ignition zone. They need to make some generalizations, and their risk tolerance has changed for some areas. But I think, like other folks pointed out, when someone gets a letter in the mail saying we'd be happy to continue offering you coverage if you implement these changes within 60 days, it gets people moving very quickly and under duress in some cases. But yeah, we're just continuing to move along to understand those partners' interests and to do the same to reciprocate that.
Very good. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. Any others want to comment on insurance actions? Okay, not seeing anything. Next thing down I wanted to touch on was working with, at the county level, groups working on invasive species or weed control and the communications that they utilize. And I know that conservation districts are very involved with those groups. I really liked what I heard from the Wyoming group about that. And I suspect that that's happening in other areas, but I don't know that there's an organized structure with the conservation districts and, let's say, the Invasive Species Council. I don't know that. Are folks really working in that realm as well? Go ahead, Lisa.
We have a very strong 4-county weed management area, and they work with the state, they work with the federal government, PGE, and especially in the Clackamas Basin, we have a cooperative agreement. But we also have another county weed management agency group in the Gorge. So we do have a lot of invasive work going on in our area, and big, strong partnerships with the federal government and the state government agencies.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Any others?
I just echo what Lisa has, here in Wyoming, obviously we work closely with our weed and pest districts, but we take it, we've wrote grants cooperatively or jointly together to help combat invasive species. We have a task force in our county that meets with a lot of the same players that deal with the wildfire stuff, because it is natural resource management on a landscape scale, and you have to involve all those people, or else you're not going to have a very easy time of hitting your goals on that scale.
Good point, Mike. And I bring them up because they're also working the land at the same level that conservation districts are, and they have different access to funding sources and probably suffer from the capacity issues that conservation districts do. Am I correct on that? Okay, I saw your head nod. Thank you. Okay. Anything else on that? Not
Sure,
seeing-
and
yeah,
just one other along the lines of what Mike said. We've got a weed management association in this area. It's been established for 20 years. Strong partnerships across all that mixed ownership. There's 12 to 15 partners in that group, sharing resources, supervision of staff, equipment, to meet more ecosystem level goals across boundaries. And then I think it's interesting to note too, just the types of fires we've seen the past maybe 8 or 9 years in the more developed areas, often are just moderate angle slopes and buttes in town with cheatgrass on them. Definitely seeing a pattern of that. And cheatgrass is establishing in much larger quantities here. It's something that is definitely relevant to just wildfire risk reduction here.
Yes, definitely. I've heard that across the country, and it's a tough one to get a hold of for sure. I am going to.
So, Ann, this is John Roos.
Hey, John.
I wanted to throw out one quick little thing on the invasives component of it, and I think the thing that bothers me the most about invasives and our inability to make headway and lots of progress and come up with lots of money and funding for the invasives problem is, it has no, there's no thrill to it. There's no mystique to it. There's no draw to the public to it. They don't understand it. Wildfire, you can see the big wildfire. In my case, wild horses. People see wild horses and you can get all sorts of money for that. But invasive species is not something that draws people's attention. And that's something that we need to figure out how to change that dynamic.
I agree with you completely. Thank you, John. You know, hey, Tom Harbor, are you still on? Did I lose you already? He was the gentleman working with the Department of Defense, and I know they've had a significant program working on invasive. So I was hoping to try to have him chime in with you, John, on what you're talking about. It's not a sexy program. It's not the planes in the air and the flames and all this, but you know, cheatgrass and the things that's happening, the fire behavior, the increase in the risk to firefighters and is just astronomical, and we really have to get a handle on it if we can. We need to, I don't know how you're gonna soup it up at all, but to get, you know, attention on it. But as long as we keep talking about this and we know that the ground level people are aware of the problem of it, I hope that we can do something about it. Thank you, John.
You bet.
Anyone else have anything they want to share? There looks like there's Adam Moore, if you're still on, there's a link in the chat that you shared, and there's a brochure that identifies something with insurance and wildfire. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? If not, I'll check it out as soon as we're done with the meeting so I can see what that is and be sure to share that with everyone. Thank you so much for posting it.
Sure.
Right.
I work with the Colorado State Forest Service, and we've done some joint education and outreach efforts with the Rocky Mountain Insurance Association. And this is a publication that we jointly came up with, and we've jointly presented at a variety of wildfire conferences. So we're actively, we have the same concerns and problems with insurance companies as you guys have expressed. We're trying to get ahead of the curve by working with them, and this brochure is one of those examples.
Insurance and wildfire. Anybody else, can you hear him? Can you hear me okay? All right.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about losing you, Adam. All right. I'm sorry to lose him on that one. That sounded like it was really good. I'll definitely share that with folks and have that in the desk guide that I'm working on. And with that, I'm going to move down into another action, focus on action that I think was important and touches most of us on here, and that is partnerships with like critter organizations, or some of the political world, we call them hook and bullet. So whatever you call them, you know, they're making a difference on the land, and there's a lot of people that are interested in improving wildlife habitat. So the more we can do to invite them to the table, I think is a really good step. So I see that as a solid action, improving collaboration with folks like in that sector. A lot of the community planning that we've all done, we talk about how the private sector is going to come in and help us out, but we didn't invite them to the table to tell them. And unfortunately, I think some of the public utilities and such are in the same situation. We talked about them when we were developing the cohesive strategy. We talked about the risk and what was happening in the right of ways and knew that they needed to be addressed. Did we invite them to the table? I don't recall. So we're kind of picking up the pieces on that one. Unfortunately, with the aging infrastructure of utilities around the country, I think we're going to see some more concern there, and probably more regulation would be my guess. So moving on with the next action, I move down into looking at the shared stewardship and those silos that Lowell was talking about. Arizona's data portal is really something I think as critical that we look at trying to expand. And I'm super excited that Mike Beacom has already gotten the one-pager on that. And I hope that we can follow up an action from that discussion and that effort. if any other folks that are still on here, their state has a similar portal with the Conservation Districts Association, I would love to hear about it. I'll move on, and if someone has something, add that in the chat, please. The next thing down was looking at just the sharing of information, like what Lisa had with the, fire awareness and fire preparedness for, landowners. It's not just the house. A lot of the times on fires and folks that I've talked to, the homeowner says, I really appreciate it to the firefighters for saving their home, but they wished that they would have saved their barn because the barn had the expensive equipment in it. It wasn't insured. And I have to say, the more we can educate folks about the importance of communications with your firefighters, your local fire departments, how to prepare yourself, I think the better off we'll be. A lot of times you'll see the Firewise and the news flashes for Fire Awareness Week or month, but it doesn't really show preparedness around your barn or outbuildings. And I think the number of outbuildings constantly keeps going up and up as far as loss of structures due to fire and so on. The next thing down, I really want to touch on, and that was the coordination with the delegation of authority and recognizing local landowners and local conservation districts and their structure within the organizational structure of governance when it comes to wildfire or disaster response in general. And the more that we can do education on conservation districts, I think the better. And so if folks have things that you would like to share or talk about, or tools that you've used to engage with your local county emergency managers, would be really helpful. I liked that there was connections with FEMA, and I definitely plan to have follow-up actions that touch on training. I really liked how with Lori and Lisa and others talked about how, it's tough in a small conservation district working on something that you don't have a capacity for. So you're working extra hours, but you're kind of throwing your hat in the ring and hoping that or fishing, whatever analogy you want to use, that you're successful in getting some funding out of this to help you, put together a program that'll help your communities and your landowners. Training is definitely one piece that I think all agencies can get behind, whether it's NRCS and NASF and the state foresters, and all the grant streams really need to try to help with additional education, training opportunities, not only just to advance what they're doing within their federal programs, but to pass it through to local landowners to help really change the landscape. Just like the planning, it's great to have a community fire plan, but unless you're doing what the priorities were identified in there, it's still a plan on the shelf. We got to move the needle. You got to do something on the land to make it happen. That takes money and time and people. So with that action, that's the last one that I have on here. I really like the bear discussion, Craig, and fully plan on including that in the training component that ties to the red card process and such. Recognition of prior learning has been a program that the National Fire Center, Interagency Fire Center has talked about for years, and how that actually reaches out to conservation districts is something that I'm going to follow up on as a key action to elevating the expertise that's found in conservation districts. So that is the wrap up on actions. What did I miss that really talks to you? Not hearing anything. And we still have 35 people on, so thank you all for hanging with us. I do want to.
This is Steve Hayes.
Yes, go ahead, Steve.
I know what's on paper, and as it relates to, let's say, law enforcement, county officials, county OES, they appear to know what to do. But the the point is that with the RCD, ours in particular, maybe it's different for others, is that there was not a simulation, a drill. How do we work together? So without being informed or notified, maybe they're doing that already, but we're not part of that. So it's a large question, and at the same time, I think it could be a good opportunity.
No, I completely understand what you're saying. I think the first place to start on that, Joe Stutler, who I mentioned before, is co-chair of the regional committee for the West, and Katie works with, has been a county forester in Deschutes County, Oregon for many years. And prior to that, in still a 34 plus or 40-year career with the Forest Service, significant amount of experience and expertise. And I really think that he would be a really good one to follow up, Steve, with what you're talking about and identifying some solid actions. I know Joe has made a significant difference in Deschutes County in getting county lands that people weren't able to maintain or lost throughout some of the housing problems in 2008 and such. And so it went back to the county, and the county ended up with a big problem and how to, reduce risk on that. So I think he lends a lot of experience to what you're bringing up, and potentially could identify some actions for us. So I'll definitely do that. Thank you for chiming in. And Doug Rushton, I appreciate your comment. Coordination with Western Governors Association. I know that they have in their policy resolutions a cohesive strategy. They felt that it's so strongly about supporting development and implementation of the cohesive strategy that in their policy resolution, they supported development and implementation of all 3 regions in the country, regardless of the West. And that being because a lot of the times the fire resources that we need in the West come from New Jersey or Minnesota. A lot of the aviation resources come down from Alaska and Florida Fire Service. And it's amazing to me how networked we really are in this country when it comes to it. But the Western governors have always supported that, and from border to border of this country. So thank you for that suggestion. Any others that I may have missed? All right. Thank you so much for that. The next thing I'm not sure, is Coleman on by chance? Coleman Garrison from NACD, Director of Government Affairs.
I don't believe he is, Ann.
Okay, Mary Scott, are you on?
I am on, yes.
Would you mind giving us just a little update on policies and such?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to give a quick update on what is going on in the natural resource world. For those of you that I don't know yet, I'm Mary Scott. I'm the Natural Resource Policy Specialist over at NACD. I work with Coleman Garrison in the Government Affairs shop, where I handle both regulatory and legislative actions related to natural resource policy. So just a couple bills that are floating around right now that would probably be good to flag for folks that NACD has been working on. One of those is the Repairing Existing Public Lands by Adding Necessary Trees Act, and it is quite a mouthful. So it is also known as the Replant Act for short. And that was introduced by Senators Stabenow and Portman and Congressman Panetta and Simpson. And the big takeaway item from that bill is it would remove the current $30 million funding cap on the Reforestation Trust Fund, and it would make nearly $123 million available annually for Forest Service to use in that program. So that was introduced last Congress. NACD supported it then. It was reintroduced again this year, where we did support it this year as well. So watching that bill and having those discussions with Congress on what might happen with that piece of legislation. The other bill that NAC supported last year that has not been reintroduced yet this year, but we are looking forward to the day that that does happen, is the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act. And that was introduced by Senator Daines and Senator Feinstein. And this bill really came from an effort from Feinstein wanting to do something in her home state of California, where obviously the wildfires are, for lack of better terms, very much out of control. So, and of course, Daines, being from Montana, is no stranger to wildfire either. So they have been working together. It is a bipartisan bill. and they're hoping to reintroduce it here soon. Some of the big items in that bill are funding opportunities for landscape scale restoration projects, and those would be taking place probably in several of the Western states. There hasn't been a ton of new information on what the 2021 bill will have in it, but those projects funding will be available for those projects. The bill also attempts to fix the Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. So that is the consultation process where when new information is found regarding endangered species, folks then have to go back and look at that new information. So that would hopefully fix that section of the Endangered Species Act. And then the bill also highlights the importance of grazing and prescribed burns, which NACD is supportive of. One bill that NACD has not come out to support yet, but I am looking into, it was just introduced by Senator Brasso, is the Resilient Rangelands and Effective Grazing Management, or also known as the Ranch Act. And that bill would allow for emergency grazing in case of extreme disasters. So think wildfire or anything else that may make it where folks couldn't graze in certain areas. So we will be taking a look at that. And for the Public Lands RPG, which I am the staffer for, will be meeting on Monday, and we'll be chatting about that bill as well. So that's kind of what's going on Capitol Hill. And then, of course, working with the agencies, NACD submitted comments last year to DOI on their invasive species strategic management plan. Some of our language on education of invasive species actually made it into the final document. So we're very excited about that. We do regularly comment on BLM actions as well. And just as issues arise that are policy related, would encourage folks to reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat about policy and resource issues. And with that, I think we'll wrap up.
Sounds good. Mary, is there anything you can add about the climate comments that NACD just provided?
Oh man, I knew this question was coming.
I know. I'm
really, Coleman would really be the better bet for that. And unfortunately, he isn't on. But I would, if anyone has any questions about those comments, either email me and I'll loop Coleman in, or email him directly, and I can drop my email in the chat.
That sounds great. And if we can, we'll get a copy of those and link to them if they're available. That sounds
great.
I think
that's really doable.
Okay. Thanks for doing that impromptu. I appreciate it. And I do miss Coleman on here. I was worried about that when we were making plans through the dry run. If I put him at the end, he'd already be off work. So because he's East Coast time. But all right. Any questions for Mary? Okay, her email is in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay, Steve asked, it was mentioned earlier about Joint Chiefs and RCDs participating. Is there any additional information on that? Mike or Mary or? Yeah.
No, it's just something we promote to districts every year. I think up to present, in 6 or 7 years of that initiative, districts have been involved in about 50% of those grants awarded by Forest Service and NRCS. And so that too is something the Joint Forestry team tries to work to coordinate, but we definitely feel like where those partnerships happen, districts are a good fit to be part of that multi-partner effort.
Sounds great, thank you. All right, anything else? Any other comments or questions from folks? All right. Well, first off, I definitely want to thank everyone for your participation and your comments and engagement today. It's been an exciting day. I'm super, super happy to be working on identifying actions for accelerating the implementation of the cohesive strategy with you and everyone that's been on here today. I want to call out the planning group for the Western Summit. Mike Hinn, Rob Scroy, Hunter Pesh. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Did I get that right, Hunter?
It's Petch, but you were close.
Petch. I knew I was going to mess that up, but thank you. Sorry about that. Ariel Rivers, Rachel Thieler. Is that right? Okay. And Mary Scott, thank you all. Mike Beacom, thank you so much for your guidance throughout all of this and being the master behind the Zoom. So thank you. And thank you everyone on here for, again, your engagement in this, and especially to the speakers for sharing what's been going on. I really do appreciate your time and commitment when I know there's a lot of other things you could be doing, and there's competition for Zoom. So I really appreciate it. There will be a short survey that goes out from SurveyMonkey. I please ask you to take the time to do it. It's really important. I will have one of those empty blocks where I want you to add in stuff where, what do you see next? Would you like another summit like this? What do you want to hear more about? So it'll be a little bit of an open-ended type, you know, I hate those empty boxes when I get to them on a survey, because then I really got to think about this. I don't have to just check a box, but please do. It really is helpful. And I want the survey to be useful. It'll be something that helps direct us into the future. The next thing I wanted to talk about was that, again, the desk guide, I will be reaching back out to the planning group and also to folks that registered on here to take a quick look at a draft desk guide that will help conservation districts when they need to have a resource guide that helps them. Say they've had a fire in their district, or they want to do a program with building community wildfire protection plans for their neighbors or such. I'm excited about that and expect to have a draft sometime in the near future. Fortunately, I don't have that dialed down yet. I've been focused on the summits. But the other thing I want to talk about, speaking of the summits, there's 2 more of these. One that is for the Southeast, and that's next week. May 11th and 12th, 2 half-day sessions. It is not going to be much like this one. Tools such as fire in the Southeast, you know, it's not as much, it's not considered a problem. So they really have a different perspective about it and use fire. And the network and the prescribed fire councils, I urge you to try to join at least a little bit of that. The agendas are on the NACD event website. So if you want to take a quick peek at those, you can find that and also register for those summits. It'll be a different Zoom link for you to access those. Also, there's one in the Northeast of the Northeast 20 states of the US, and that'll be on May 25th and 26th. Again, 2 half-day sessions. So again, their agenda draft is online and you can take a look at it. And again, their main focus is about protecting water. And water is something that is definitely critical and important to every region in the country. But the perspectives that you'll hear about in the Northeast Summit are unique, very unique. And the home, you know, the host state for the Southeast is Alabama, and the host state for the Northeast is Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. But they also have one of the premier fire response organizations in the country from the state agencies and as well as the federal agencies partnering together. So with that, I urge you to register and join us for the other summits. It's been a pleasure and an honor to work with you all today. And with that, I will sign off and say thank you again. Have a good rest of your afternoon.